New Thought Media Network is proud to present New Thought's Roots and Branches with Reverend Dr. Ruth Miller. Join us every Tuesday at 4 p.m. Mountain Time. Tune in live or watch anytime on our YouTube channel. Discover the rich history of New Thought and its impact on modern spirituality. Join Reverend Dr. Ruth Miller as she shares insights, stories, and teachings that inspire and uplift. Experience deep insights and transformative teachings that connect you to the roots of New Thought. Visit our YouTube channel to catch up on past episodes and join us live every Tuesday at 4 p.m. Connect with us and be part of the journey.
Hello, and welcome to New Thought Roots and Branches. Last week, when we met, we explored the really fundamental ideas that have been present in human culture for thousands of years. This week, we're going to go a little bit further. I thought we would look first at the overall view, the complexity of all the various people that have contributed to New Thought. So in our first slide, you get to see a little bit of the modern folks involved in this marvelous branching tree we call New Thought. And I don't expect you to grasp that at this time. We'll go more into it later. And there's another version of it. Yeah, there's the one that has the pictures of a lot of the teachers that a lot of you can recognize. And then another version of it that talks about how they relate to each other and what institutions grew out of each of their teachings. And then another version of the chart that looks more at the roots, and that's what we're going to be looking at today. Last time we looked at the top part of this chart. That'll be in the next slide. And these are some of the ancient traditions that have contributed to modern New Thought, because New Thought is not modern, really. It's letting us know that letting go of an old thought and replacing it with a new one is the thing we need to be doing, right? All these ancient traditions have helped people understand that and help people understand some of our basic concepts of oneness, of connectedness, of all the ways that the universe is one whole being of which we are part. Now, this week, we're going to go into the specific people that informed the very, very, very early teachers. And in our next slide, we can see how those folks are connected. These are people who were living in the 1700s and 1800s, early 1800s. And most of the people that we will be studying will be following in their footsteps. So on our next slide, we're going to introduce us to the earliest of those, Emanuel Swedenborg. And in that process, he's going to have helped us lay out these points. All right, the unity of all that is. The understanding that whatever it is we're looking at, it is all that is. It's part of all that is. The recognition that everything is good in humanity and in the world around us. These ideas that came out of that European period, starting with Swedenborg and going through these other men we're looking at, are going to provide the basis for where Emerson went and for other folks went in the years to follow. We get that fundamental idea that a personal knowledge, a direct communication with the divine, with no intermediary, is fundamental to being a human being. And we see the valuing of nature rather than of materialism, the material things that we have been taught to value. So this whole body of thinking began to emerge in Europe, as opposed to the rest of the world, along about the 1700s. Our first spokesman for this way of looking at it was a scientist, Emanuel Swedenborg, who was born at the end of the 1600s and lived a long life, well to the end of the 1700s. Swedenborgian thinking is still part of some people's lives, and it definitely informed all of the transcendentalists of Europe and later in America. He lived in Sweden. Funny thing about that. His family were miners. They were a wealthy mining family. They owned mines. And so he became a mining engineer. He was on the Royal Institute of Mines. He studied mathematics. He studied physics. He studied all these wonderful good things. He also studied astronomy. So he was very much into the sciences and applying them. And an appropriate scholar in his time also understood Greek. And he went into the ancient philosophers and the modern philosophers as well. At that time, that would have been Locke and Leibniz and those guys, trying to understand the relationship between the physics and the human experience. Well, in 1718, when he was about 30, he published an article that was beginning to attempt to explain spiritual and mental events as vibrations. Now, for us today, that's not at all unusual. Most of us have been hearing that in our world around us. But to be talking about that in 1718 is pretty amazing. A few years later, he published a pamphlet that suggested that the soul and the body are connected. Oh, this was a very big deal way back then. He was suggesting that they were not separate. And, well, it became necessary because of the need to not have the Inquisition burn scientists at the stakes, to have the church deal with the soul and science deal with bodies, physical bodies of all kinds. So nobody really picked up on that except for those edgy sorts of people who identified with Swedenborg. Then, after a number of years, when he'd been wrestling with this idea, what is the soul and how does it connect with the body? And how does what I know, what he knew about gravity and the physics of vibrations all work together? He was having dinner at a tavern and a strange man showed up in the shadows and seemed to be beckoning him, but he ignored him. And he went home, and that same man showed up in his room, and he came to believe that was Jesus Christ, and that Jesus Christ was calling him to write a book called The Heavenly Doctrine that would reform the Christianity of his day. Now, we're talking Sweden in the 1600s. This is about a little bit after Shakespeare. Actually, we're in the 1700s for this point in Swedenborg's life. So we're about 100 years after Shakespeare and James and Bacon, and those guys were all making things clear in the traditional King James Bible and the Shakespearean plays, and a good deal after Newton and Descartes and all those guys. So they were pretty well established in the culture. It was after the Reformation, long after the Reformation, and Sweden at that time were Lutherans. They were Lutherans of the very dogmatic and doctrinal type. And he felt, based on the work that he was experiencing, the work that he was studying, and the work that was going on inside him, his internal experiences, these dreams that he was having, that Christianity was off the mark. It's not what Jesus had in mind. So he wrote The Heavenly Doctrine. That carried him for quite a while. He ended up writing it and rewriting it over and over again in his life, and finally ended up doing a brief version of it in 1774, one that was called The True Christian Religion. And that was what explained what it was that he was trying to say in The Heavenly Doctrine to the Lutherans around him in Sweden. Notice that 1771 was his last year on the planet. So at that point, I think he figured his life was done. But Swedenborgianism continues even as we go forward in today's modern world. So in our next slide, you can see some of the points that he made. First of all, there is only one God, okay? One person. And that one person he called the Christ. Now, in the Jewish tradition, the Messiah is the person who is so connected with God, so pure, that he can transform and undo all wrongs. In Greek, the term Christ didn't exist, and so they kind of modified the word best, Christos, and applied it to this person that they called Jesu, and we know as Jesus Christ. But the Christ is not the same as the man, Jesus Christ. And a lot of people, and Swedenborg was part of that, Jesus was the embodiment at that time of this person, the Christ, that is all people, one God, one person, and we are all it. He had a number of amazing experiences, mystical experiences that went on for years, and he described many of them in various books. And in those experiences, he believed and he described going to physical places called heaven and called hell. So he described them in very physical terms. And he had angels as physical experiences. And he also visited other planets. He didn't visit their heavens, but he decided that each planet must have its own heaven, because after all, in an infinite God, infinity is possible, right? Then, as he was trying to describe these things and explain these things, he used a lot of symbols. So I wonder sometimes if his descriptions of heaven and hell in physical terms weren't related to his descriptions of other things in physical terms. For example, as are in the slide, when we look at a city, we're talking about structures and religious systems. Or if we look at, something, a snake, we're talking about something that is evil. So he used physical images to help explain abstract concepts in many ways. And it makes it hard for materialists to follow sometimes what he is saying. The other piece that he really was very interested in was what he called correspondences. And another way of thinking of that is as above, so below, as within, so without. That what is going on in the natural world and the spiritual world correspond. You can count on finding in the natural world what is actually happening in the physical world, and if you're a spiritual world. And if you're focusing on the spiritual world, the natural world will come into alignment with it. So correspondences. The other thing that he encouraged and valued far more than the physical experience is the spiritual. He encouraged people to focus on the spiritual. He was really quite convinced that the spiritual was going to be the basis for all of our well-being. All right. And if you think about what he was looking at, he would explain the spiritual world as nested boxes, if you will, spheres within spheres within spheres. There's the sphere of the human activity, and then there are spheres of higher levels of spirit and higher levels, until finally you get that whole sphere of God, right? So that spheres within spheres to help us understand. And the soul would move from the very human physical sphere to another level, and then another level and another level as the soul went on its journey. He also talked about the qualities that are associated with each of those spheres and wanted us to see that they tended to show up in dual terms. So in the physical sphere, we're going to see a lot of physical dualities and qualities in pairs, right? Sexuality, for example. But in the next sphere, we get more qualities of faith. Faith being a quality that is in parallel with charity. That is, the extent to which I have faith in my well-being is the extent to which I will experience and express charity. And finally, his main points include the idea that humanity is transforming. It's transforming from the material view to a spiritual rebirth. And he says that that is the best way to read the Bible. Now, Swedenborg, as you saw, was on the planet from 1688 to 1772. We're going to look at the overlaps in a little bit, but our next important person is Immanuel Kant. Immanuel Kant, who was on the planet while Swedenborg was alive, but stuck around a little longer. He was in Germany. A lot of you have heard about Kant, or Kant, as some people say, but in German they would say Kant. And he was not a philosopher by trade. He was a mathematician and a physicist. So we have another hard scientist here. He was teaching physics and natural law, some logic at the university, his whole life. That's what he did. And his early papers, even before he was brought on as a physicist, as a teacher, had to do with the relationship between the moon's gravity and our tides. He tried to explain how earthquakes happen. And he had a theory that the sun formed from a gas cloud. I wonder where he got that idea. Our current science absolutely supports that. It was only very late in life that he wrote these papers that he's best known in today's world for, his papers on ethics and aesthetics and metaphysics. And the big one was a huge work, huge work, almost as big as Swedenborg's Heavenly Discourse, The Critique of Pure Reason. Now, he's not saying don't be rational. He's saying if all you're relying on is your rational process, you've got problems, okay? And in that, he says we need to acknowledge that space and time have form, and that form can be analyzed. He also points out that we can know things prior to having an experience. This was huge. And this is very much in alignment with what we learned last week with Plato and Plotinus and that whole Neoplatonist idea that knowledge or the actuality exists quite apart from our experience of it in the physical. If we continue with what Kant is saying, he gives us some specific principles. He wants us to understand that all we experience are phenomenal appearances. This is Neoplatonism. It's also modern neurophysiology, because it turns out that what is entering into the brain takes and adapts and decides what to tell the mind is actually happening. So the experience of the world around us is not about things out there. It's about what's going on in here. And so he says that all change must consist in the alteration or change of states in an underlying substance whose existence and quantity must be unchangeable. That is, there is an underlying spiritual substance. We would call it perhaps today the quantum field. It doesn't change, but everything comes from there and goes back into there. And he says that there is a causal law. We can count on absolute laws that are consistent with regard to what's going on in that underlying substance. In the Hindu tradition, as we saw last time, that underlying substance would be called Brahman, that quantum beingness that from which all things emerge. He defined God as a community, the common ground of all possibilities, Brahman. And then he says there are two sorts of ends that it's our duty to have. This is a translation from the German. He says our own perfection and the happiness of others. So transcendentalism, as Louisa May Alcott points out in Little Women, it requires that we are always perfecting ourselves while we are contributing to the well-being of the people around us. Now, soon after and overlapping Kant, we have Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, who encoded idealism. He's most famous for his work called Faust. All right. He was born while Kant was still on the planet, and he stayed around to 1832. He was also, Swedenborg was still on the planet. So these guys were affecting each other. And I want to point out that Ben Franklin was involved with these guys. There was something called the Lunar Society in England with Josiah Priestley and Wedgwood and some other guys. And Ben Franklin had joined that group. And they mostly corresponded by letters, obviously. But every now and then when Franklin was in Europe, he would connect with them. And some of these guys were involved. Now, Goethe, unlike the previous two guys, did not study the sciences hardly at all. He did a little bit. If you look at the second bullet, he wrote on botany and anatomy from his garden and from his life experience. But he was mostly much more into the world of thought. He did study law, and actually he was not very appreciated as a lawyer because he didn't really like the existing system all that much. And I think that may be part of why we like Goethe so much. But when he was working, he was doing some administrative stuff. Interestingly, though, he thought a lot about color. Aesthetics and color kind of overlap, right? And he developed what we call the color wheel today, the idea that purple and orange are complementary and that you can go in gradations from one tone to another, as in the rainbow. So color, like Newton 100 years before, was very interesting to Goethe, but he wasn't thinking about it as light so much as color on paper. All fascinating stuff. The idea, though, in that color theory, he applied to the rest of the world, that gradation of colors, right? You can go from a deep, deep blue into a royal blue into something more like green, turquoise into the greens, and you can go the deep, deep blue into the deep indigo and purples into the reds in these continuous metamorphoses. He was saying that applied to biology as well and to human development. And he suggested the idea of homology, similar, you can have, or analogy in the German that he was using, analogy, that you can look at something over here and that will help you understand something over here. Well, that's a fundamental part of the systems theory, which is my graduate work, that if I will really want to understand electricity, I can probably look at how water flows and see some advantages and disadvantages and similarities there. And exactly, I can set up dams and reservoirs and they become resistors and capacitors in the electrical system. So homology. But the other piece of it is because this metamorphosis is always going on, life is change. Life is change. So Goethe never went, I told you that he didn't really like structures. So he never was very proud or very willing, let me put it that way, very willing to acknowledge the structure of the Christian church. And some of the more doctrinal Christians of his time called him the great heathen. He was a Freemason. He did not attend church. It turns out he got very excited about an ancient Baltic tradition that's called Hypsisterianism, which reverenced perfectionism. And remember what I said, this transcendental movement was the process of perfecting oneself. And if you look at Faust and you look at some of the other things that Goethe wrote, you can see that that's woven in there. He was so into it that he even started studying other languages and was particularly fond of learning Arabic script. And there's journals where he's written the classic statement of Allah, Ali Vali Allah, in Arabic, all over these pages as he's practicing the Arabic script. Goethe was not a very physical man. He was very much in his head. He did have several children, and he was, let's see, how can I say this? He was almost the classic absent-minded professor, let me put it that way. There was a time during the Napoleonic Wars when he was living in Strasbourg, which I've had the joy to see, and I can understand why he moved there. And the soldiers came into his house, broke into his kitchen and his pantry, and were partying down in his basement, and called for their host to come down and greet them. And he was already in bed. So he came down in his bedclothes, and he told them that, he didn't particularly appreciate them, but he wouldn't kick them out of the house. Shortly after which, they came up all the way into his bedroom, and the technical term for what he experienced was he was petrified. That is, instead of going into fighting or flying, he froze. His wife got out of bed and started hammering on the guys with the bedpan and the broomsticks and began to chase them out of the house. And finally, they were saved. And he wrote it later, "We were saved by luck and perseverance." The luck was, well, Goethe somehow always came out okay. And the perseverance was his wonderful, wonderful wife. So Goethe established this field, if you will, of thinking about how we can be in the world. He had worked with Kant, obviously overlapped him there in Germany, and Swedenborgianism had applied and been spreading throughout Europe for quite a while at that time. But in 1770, we start seeing the birth of this in England, and William Wordsworth and Coleridge are going to be our two guys. Wordsworth, as many of us know, you may recall some poetry that you had to learn in grade school, right? That Wordsworth wrote. It was transformative. And what was transformative about it is that fourth point, that he used common language in his poems. He didn't try to elevate his language to be very poetic and intellectual. He just used the common language. And that created a wonderful heartfelt feeling that people were not used to in poetry at that point. We're very used to it now. But at that point, it was very unusual. And he was fascinated by what people think, what he thought, where his mind went. He stayed in that field all of his life, all of his poetry, whereas basically the exploring what's going on in our minds, yeah? Interestingly, religiously, he was a conservative, never really explored his religious ideas while he was exploring this nature of the mind and saying that we can be poets in our normal life. Emerson's going to pick up on that a lot. And we're going to go on now to his best friend. Wordsworth's best friend was a guy named Samuel Coleridge, born a couple of years later, died a lot earlier because, well, he was an addict. He got into opium very early. He's another one who didn't do anything with the sciences. He was a poet. He was also a lawyer and kind of a good administrator. Periodically, people would hire him as administrator. When he was in college, he learned about poetry while he was doing, general studies. And his line is, poetry has a logic of its own, as severe as that of science and more difficult. So for him, this was a puzzle. Coleridge, he's the Rime of the Ancient Mariner guy, you know that one. And he's got this puzzle. He's trying to make it all fit and be the full expression of what it is he's aiming for. Now, he was involved with a group that was trying to create a utopia. And that utopia was going to be in Pennsylvania. They called it Plandisocracy. It didn't work. They weren't able to raise the funds. They weren't able to get enough volunteers, but they were very excited about what that could look like. He also served briefly as a Unitarian minister in a couple of places. But Joseph Priestley said, no, I don't want you to be a minister, especially not a Unitarian. I'm going to pay you some money and you're going to go to Germany and study with Kant, which now Coleridge did. Wordsworth followed. They wandered around Germany together. And so that's where a lot of that transcendentalist idea began to be expressed in their poetry. One of the important things to Coleridge was that things grow organically and that the common law was that natural basis on which all things might happen. Now, if you're not familiar, common law is what was established in part in the Magna Carta. It's basic understandings in British law in particular that you don't need to write a legislation about because that's just how it is. And he believed that we could understand the social world, the social matrix, in terms of organic growth and common law. And he actually suggested some reforms that could be added into our jurisprudence, which is why he got into the utopian movement. He had some ideas about all of that. His journal, The Friend, which he then compiled into books, included something called Essays on the Principles of Method. And here he's saying, if you're, this is organic growth. There's some things that are permanent and you're going to progress around them. And the community, the concepts, these fundamental concepts, community, the idea of commonality, the idea that there are natural principles and processes were woven into this essay. And I believe that is really his major contribution to transcendentalist thought all across Europe, in all the Western countries. So if we look further, we begin to get a person that most people say came over from England, but it turned out he was born in the States. And this is William Ellery Channing. Again, he's born after Swedenborg has died, but these other guys are still on the planet while he's growing up. So he's hearing some of these things. He was a student at Harvard and graduated and went on into the ministry. He became the minister of the major church, Boston church, and over time converted it to Unitarianism. He was on the board of Harvard College and was instrumental in bringing about Harvard Divinity School as a Unitarian school, which it still is, by the way. If you want to be a Unitarian minister, there are 2 divinity schools that you can go to that are explicitly Unitarian. And one of them is Harvard, and the other one is at Berkeley, the Star Seminary there. So what Channing did was bring that whole concept of there is one God into the thinking and speaking of New England in that period. Now, notice he's born after the American Revolution, so he is very much an American. He is not a European who happens to be living in the colonies. So he's a U.S. citizen, and he is rejecting the idea that there is a Father, a Son, and a Holy Spirit, but there is only one God, Unitarianism, okay, as opposed to Trinitarianism. And the other piece of that is called universalism. Now, he didn't officially connect with universalism. Unitarians and Universalists didn't get together until 1965. But at that time, he's saying humans are basically good. Well, that goes all the way back into the European transcendentalists, yes? Then he talks about reason. And what he's trying to do is help people understand that we can find our own path to understanding our spiritual world. We are not stuck with what other people have said over thousands of years. And in fact, the term theology kind of didn't work for him. So we want to bring our mind to understanding our spiritual life. And he said, perfection. Humans can become like God. We all have the potential to become like God, and you got to believe it. He got a lot of flack for that in those days. How dare you suggest such a thing? But that was one of the points that he made on a regular basis. And part of that is God can't be separate from the world. God's presence, God's beingness infuses all that is. So Channing was a speaker in Boston while some of the early New Thought folks, especially Ralph Waldo Emerson, were growing up. Our next guy's back in the U.S., or back in England, I'm sorry, he's no longer in the U.S. We're back with John Stuart Mill. And this guy's actually more of a contemporary of our American New Thought founders, but he was considered one of the grand old men, if you will, because he was building on theories that were very, very well established very early on in his career, partly because of him. So he grew up in England. He also lived in France. And his whole life was the creation of a just society. That's where he was focused. So like Coleridge, who was looking at, there must be a way that we can have a social system that works, that community and organic growth and common law and that infusion of the divine is possible. John Stuart Mill built on that. And there was a time when he was beginning to give up because things weren't changing. None of us have experienced that. He was reading Wordsworth poetry, and that pulled him out of that giving up. So Wordsworth contributed in many ways to this thinking that we're having. Well, Mill was a bit of a prodigy. I've stuck this in here because it amazes me. He was literally reading the Aeneid in Greek at 3. That was the first written work he was handed, and he used that infantile capacity to learn Greek, to speak English, but he read Greek. And then by the time he was 8, they figured he could handle Latin, and he was studying the natural sciences. At 8, he was the tutor for the younger kids. Oh, my goodness. Well, at 12, his father was working on a book. His father was an economist, an historical economist. And so he was studying economics with his father, and he was also studying logic. And the economics of Adam Smith and David Ricardo. Adam Smith is that guy that talks about free market and the invisible hand. And in another place, we can talk about his economic models. But Mill was building on that work, and he helped his father write something called The Elements of Political Economy when he was 15. So imagine from 3 to 15, you're steeped in these ancient ideas and you're bringing them into the modern world, working in partnership with your father. It just fascinates me. So during that time, his father had a variety of friends, and he managed to connect with a guy named Auguste Comte, who is considered the father of sociology. So he was writing back and forth. They were pen pals. They would write several times a year because, well, things took a while to get around in those days. And so what Comte brought to sociology, created it with, was the idea that there is an individual, there are groups of individuals, but they're still individuals. So this concept of individuality, that there are systems of society, that economy is something that can be talked about as an historical process and is related to how people interact, which is what politics is about, was part of his thinking very, very early on. Now, this prodigy was hired as an executive in the East India Company at 17. Can you imagine this kid showing up and trying to act like an adult? It must have been hard. He really felt strongly that they were doing good things by sharing British values around the world and by sharing other countries' products around the world. Later, he did kind of reject the idea that Brits should be controlling India, even though most of his life he was on the edge of that. So there was some lack of consistency, I think, between his work and his words. But when he woke up, he was elected to Parliament one term because he was just a little too individualistic. But in his one term, he was calling for women's suffrage and the end of slavery. And he supported the formation of unions and what were called, and still are called, farmers' cooperatives. Now, that's different from the co-op when you go to the store and you all own it together. A farmers' cooperative is everyone is bringing their goods and they're sharing the equipment to be able to make it available to others, and they're sharing the profits. So a farmers' cooperative. Another person who was very active in the farmers' cooperative movement was Beatrix Potter. At about the same time. But that's another story as well. So many people, so many overlapping lives. So if we look at Mill's ideas, what he contributed to our work today, we're talking about the realization that the only basis for interfering in anybody else's life is for self-protection or preventing harm to others. And that applies to governments and to individuals. He's very much the individualist. He is very much feeding into the idea of self-reliance. He also brings the idea of discovering truth, searching for and discovering truth. This is now a fundamental principle of Unitarian Universalism, but the idea that each of us needs to find our own truth. And we saw that earlier in some of these other guys, right? Then a huge thing, being anti-slavery because of the above statements, and he was very actively supporting the Union during the Civil War. One of the things that he said, and I've actually included him as his quotes on this, actions are right in the proportion as they tend to promote happiness. They are wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. And to achieve the greatest good for the greatest number is the result of human action. So that's his general statement of being, that we need to be finding that which is our joy, finding that which, some of you remember Joseph Campbell, follow your bliss, right? It's that kind of assumption, and that we're here to help others be able to do the same. And if we're not helping them do the same, then we're doing something wrong, right? All right. Ultimately, though, those pleasures, that happiness, are not material. They must be intellectual and moral or spiritual. So again, we get that flip away from it's all about how much stuff you have to it's all about what's going on in here. And that is fundamental to this whole thing. So to put all those guys together in the next slide, they are overlapping. I just thought it'd be useful because I know I have a hard time hanging on to dates, that you might enjoy seeing how they overlapped a bit. So Swedenborg in Sweden, and then Kant and Goethe in Germany, Wordsworth and Coleridge, and ultimately Mill in England, and Channing emerging out of that. So that's the kind of the timeline and the overlapping qualities of these guys as we go through this process. Transcendentalism is fundamental to New Thought. So if we go back to the original map that I'm pulling from here, we have the top half is all those ancient things that we talked about last week, and then we have this band across the middle, this band of these individuals who were, above that dotted line, who were bringing those ideas into Western culture, framing them in poetry, framing them in science, in philosophy, and making them available for other people to explore. This is pretty much the foundation, the roots of this field, this movement, this way of being, whatever you want to call it, that I've been calling, and most of us call, New Thought. Now, some of you are going to wonder, well, what about, where does unity, where does religious science, where does all that come in? That's all below the dotted line. And we're going to spend the next few months going through the lives of all those good people. So that's what this program is about. And I'm hoping that you will start to have the experience of living some of these ideas. These guys worked really hard to put their ideas across for us in many, many different ways. And we have been the benefactors of their work. And for this, I am eternally grateful. And I think you will be too, as we go forward, looking at the lives of all these good people. Thank you so much for joining me here on our second episode of New Thought, Roots and Branches. Have a wonderful, wonderful time as you explore your inner world and know the truth of your being. For so it is. And so I say namaste. The divinity in me beholds the divinity in you. Thank you very much.